everyone and welcome to Wormwood Tales. Relax and enjoy the story for sleep video. Before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Let's begin. Before you settle into your bed tonight, I want you to do something simple but powerful. Turn off your lights, and let the room fall into complete darkness. Take a moment to feel the quiet around you. Now, as you lie back, open your eyes and look into the black screen in front of you. Let it become a doorway into the unknown. In the stillness, you'll find a world waiting for you. A world where light is a distant memory and darkness holds the answers. Take a deep breath and let go of everything around you. You're about to step into a place where the only thing that matters is what you can't see. Look into the black screen. Let it consume you. Let it follow you into sleep, and remember, it's not just a screen. It's a doorway. Let's begin. The Lalaurie mansion was infamous, a name that sent chills down spines even among seasoned paranormal investigators. For Elizabeth Liz Harrington, it wasn't just a haunted house, it was a personal obsession. Stories of Madame Delphine Lalaurie's monstrous deeds had kept her awake as a child, and as an adult, those same tales fueled her relentless pursuit of the supernatural. When Liz received an invitation to conduct a full investigation of the mansion alone, she didn't hesitate. Many had entered the mansion with cameras and recorders, but few had left unscathed. Some claimed it was haunted by the restless souls of Lalaurie's victims. Others whispered that the mansion itself was alive, a malevolent force feeding on fear. Liz wasn't afraid. She was determined. As she stood before the iron gates, staring up at the imposing facade of the mansion, Liz couldn't deny the weight in the air. The house loomed like a predator, its cracked windows and peeling paint giving it an expression of cruel anticipation. She clutched her bag of equipment, a mix of cutting-edge tech and historical research, and pushed open the gate. The air changed the moment she stepped inside. It was as though the mansion was exhaling, welcoming her into its dark embrace. Liz swallowed hard, her breath fogging in the unnatural chill. She whispered into her recorder, her voice steady despite the unease prickling her skin. "This is Elizabeth Harrington, paranormal investigator. Time, 7:13 p.m. Location, Lalaurie Mansion. I've entered the premises. First impressions, the air feels heavy, oppressive. It's almost as if the house knows I'm here." The grand entrance hall was eerily silent, save for the faint creak of the wooden floor beneath her boots. Dust motes floated in the dim light, disturbed only by her movement. The air smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic, like old blood. Liz paused, her eyes drawn to a portrait hanging crooked on the wall. It was a painting of Madame Lalaurie herself, her eyes cold and calculating, following Liz as she moved. Liz felt her stomach tighten. "Just a painting," she muttered under her breath, trying to shake the feeling. But deep down, she knew this wasn't going to be like her other investigations. The deeper she ventured into the mansion, the stronger the sensation became, an undeniable presence, watching her, waiting. Her equipment began to glitch. The EMF reader spiked wildly near the grand staircase. Her thermal camera picked up faint outlines of handprints on the walls, too high to belong to any living person. And then came the whispers. Faint, almost indistinguishable, but undeniably there. Liz froze, her heart hammering. "Elizabeth." The voice, faint and feminine, seemed to come from all directions. Liz spun around, her flashlight slicing through the dark, but nothing was there. She tried to convince herself it was her imagination. But when she replayed the audio on her recorder, her blood ran cold. The voice wasn't faint anymore. "Elizabeth, you shouldn't have come." Liz tightened her grip on the recorder, the disembodied voice replaying in her mind. She steadied her breath, reminding herself why she was there, to find answers, to uncover the mansion's truth. Shaking off the unease, she ventured further, her flashlight casting long, shifting shadows on the ornate but crumbling walls. The hallway ahead stretched endlessly, its dim sconces flickering as if the mansion itself were breathing. At the end of the corridor, a grand set of double doors loomed, their intricate carvings depicting a macabre scene of masked figures dancing beneath a crescent moon. Liz hesitated, her instincts screaming to turn back. But curiosity, her lifelong companion, urged her forward. Pushing the doors open, Liz stepped into what appeared to be a ballroom. The faded remnants of opulence greeted her, a massive chandelier hung precariously above, its crystals dulled by time, and a cracked marble floor bore the scars of countless years of neglect. Yet the room felt alive, as if it remembered its history too vividly. She set her equipment down, adjusting her tripod to capture the room's eerie grandeur. As she scanned the space, her flashlight landed on a peculiar object, a grand piano in the corner, its keys yellowed and warped. Liz felt a chill run down her spine. On top of the piano lay sheet music, perfectly preserved despite the decay around it. "Impossible," Liz muttered, stepping closer. Her gloved fingers hesitated before reaching for the papers. The title at the top read "Requiem for the Forgotten." It was a piece she'd never heard of, and yet something about it felt disturbingly familiar. A sudden clang shattered the stillness. Liz whipped around, her flashlight catching movement. A chair toppled over as if someone had hurriedly left it. Her pulse quickened. "Is someone here?" she called, her voice firm but trembling at the edges. Silence answered, broken only by the faint creak of the floorboards as she edged closer to the disturbance. Her EMF reader crackled to life, the needle spiking violently. The temperature in the room plummeted, her breath now visible in the icy air. She reached for her recorder, pressing it close to her lips. "It's happening. The energy here is escalating. The ballroom seems to be the epicenter, I can feel it." Suddenly, the faint strains of piano music filled the air, each note haunting and deliberate. Liz turned back to the piano, but it remained untouched, its keys unmoving. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. As the melody reached its crescendo, the chandelier above her swayed violently. Dust and debris rained down, forcing Liz to retreat toward the door. The music stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural whisper. "You should not be here." Liz's flashlight flickered, plunging her into momentary darkness. When the light returned, her eyes widened in horror. The room had transformed, no longer decayed and empty, it was now filled with spectral figures, frozen in mid-dance. Their faces were obscured by ornate masks, but their hollow eyes seemed fixed on her. Okay, Liz whispered, backing toward the door. Her hand fumbled for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The figures began to move, their steps slow and deliberate, their masks shifting to reveal twisted, skeletal faces. Liz's voice cracked as she shouted into the recorder, "They're real. They're here." Her flashlight sputtered again, and when it returned, the room was empty once more. The air was still, but Liz could feel something pressing against her, unseen hands brushing her shoulders, her arms. She stumbled out of the ballroom, slamming the doors shut behind her. Her heart pounded as she leaned against the wall, trying to regain her composure. She glanced at her recorder, its red light blinking steadily. "Whatever this is," Liz whispered shakily, "it doesn't want me to leave." Liz took a moment to catch her breath, her back pressed against the cold, uneven wall of the hallway. Her hands trembled as she checked her recorder. It had captured everything, every whisper, every note of the phantom piano, and the low, chilling voice that seemed to echo through her mind even now. But there was no time to dwell on her fear. This was why she was here, to uncover the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. She steadied herself and glanced down the hallway, the dim light casting jagged shadows that seemed to twist and shift as if alive. The faint sound of footsteps echoed from behind her. Liz froze. The footsteps were deliberate, unhurried, but they didn't match hers. They were heavier, firmer, and coming closer. Turning slowly, she shone her flashlight into the darkened hallway behind her. Nothing. "Who's there?" she called, her voice steady but edged with caution. No answer. As she turned back, her flashlight beam caught a flicker of movement ahead. A shadow darted around the corner, quick and silent. Liz's heart raced, but she forced herself forward, gripping the recorder tightly. "This is Elizabeth Harrington," she said into the recorder, her voice trembling. "I'm continuing my investigation. Possible manifestation ahead. The energy is..." The flashlight flickered, plunging her into darkness again. A whisper drifted past her ear, so close it felt like a breath on her skin. "You're too late." Liz gasped, spinning around, but the hallway was empty. She fumbled for her backup flashlight, clicking it on. The beam illuminated the cracked wallpaper, the peeling edges curling like dead leaves. Summoning her courage, Liz followed the direction of the shadow. She reached a narrow, spiraling staircase leading downward, a part of the mansion not mentioned in any of the records she had meticulously studied. "This wasn't here before," she muttered into the recorder. The air grew colder as she descended, her footsteps echoing against the stone walls. The staircase ended in a heavy wooden door, its surface scarred and blackened as though scorched by fire. A strange, rhythmic sound emanated from beyond it, a low, throbbing hum that seemed to resonate within her chest. Liz hesitated, her hand hovering over the iron latch. "You've come this far," she whispered to herself. With a deep breath, she pushed the door open. The room beyond was vast and dimly lit, its walls lined with ancient shelves filled with tattered books and strange artifacts. A single, flickering lantern hung from the ceiling, casting eerie shadows across the space. In the center of the room stood an ornate table, its surface covered with what appeared to be ritual objects: candles, bones, and a cracked mirror. The air felt alive, vibrating with an energy so intense it made Liz's skin crawl. As she stepped closer to the table, her EMF reader spiked violently, the device emitting a high-pitched whine before abruptly shutting off. Liz reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the cracked mirror. The glass rippled like water. Before she could react, the room plunged into darkness. A deafening roar filled the air, a cacophony of voices screaming, crying, and laughing all at once. Liz staggered back, clutching her ears. When the noise ceased, a single voice remained. "You can't stop it, Elizabeth. You're part of it now." Liz's flashlight blinked back on, its beam falling on the mirror. Her own reflection stared back, but it wasn't her. The face in the glass was twisted, gaunt, and smiling a grotesque mockery of her own features. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls pulsating with life. Liz backed away, her recorder tumbling from her grasp and clattering to the floor. "I don't understand," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "What do you want from me?" The mirror shattered, shards flying through the air, though none touched her. The lantern above extinguished, plunging her into complete darkness. The only light left was the faint, blinking red of her recorder. The faint red light of Liz's recorder pulsed in the suffocating darkness, each blink a metronome for her mounting terror. Her breaths came shallow and quick as she tried to orient herself, her hands groping blindly for the shattered mirror, the walls, anything tangible to anchor her in this nightmare. Her fingers brushed cold stone, and she pressed herself against it, desperate for a sense of direction. The room seemed to hum with malevolent energy, the air vibrating around her. Liz's mind raced, replaying the distorted voice that echoed in her ears. "You're part of it now." "What does that even mean?" she whispered aloud, her voice swallowed by the oppressive silence. Summoning what courage she had left, Liz retrieved her flashlight from her belt. She clicked it on, and a thin, sputtering beam illuminated the immediate area. The space around her looked warped, as if the architecture itself had shifted while she was in the dark. The bookshelves lining the walls were now filled with grotesque objects, a jar containing a withered hand, skulls of varying sizes, and unfamiliar symbols carved into dark wood. Where the table once stood at the center of the room, there was now a gaping hole in the floor, its edges jagged and uneven. From within, a faint, flickering glow emanated, accompanied by a low, rhythmic chanting. Liz leaned closer, peering into the abyss. The glow grew stronger, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls like living entities. She couldn't make out any figures below, but the chanting low and guttural was unmistakably human. She reached for her recorder, which had somehow landed near the edge of the hole. As she grasped it, the chanting ceased abruptly, leaving an unbearable silence in its wake. "Hello," she called into the void, her voice trembling. "Is someone down there?" A sudden gust of cold air rushed upward from the hole, extinguishing her flashlight and sending her stumbling backward. She landed hard on the stone floor, her recorder slipping from her grip once more. In the faint glow from below, she saw it tumble forward, teetering on the edge of the abyss before disappearing into the darkness. "No." Liz scrambled to her knees, her hands reaching out as if she could somehow retrieve it. The recorder was her lifeline, her only proof of what was happening here. Before she could move closer, a hand shot up from the darkness, thin, skeletal, and impossibly long. Liz froze, her mind refusing to process the sight. The hand gripped the edge of the hole, followed by another, and then a head emerged. It was pale and featureless, save for two hollow, black voids where eyes should have been. Its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, revealing rows of jagged, yellowed teeth. Liz scrambled backward, her hands scraping against the rough stone floor. The figure pulled itself out of the hole, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if it didn't quite understand how to use its limbs. "Stay back," Liz stammered, though her voice lacked conviction. The figure tilted its head, regarding her with an unnerving stillness. Then, it spoke not with its mouth, but directly into her mind. "You seek the truth. This is it." The room began to shift again, the walls melting into shadows that twisted and swirled around her. Liz felt a crushing pressure in her chest, as if the air itself had turned against her. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure moved closer, its hollow eyes locking onto hers. Liz felt an overwhelming pull, as if it were reaching inside her mind, prying into her deepest fears and memories. Images flashed before her eyes, the faces of the enslaved people who had suffered within these walls, their pain and torment etched into the very fabric of the mansion. She saw Madame Lalaurie herself, her cold, calculating smile as she carried out unspeakable acts. And then, she saw herself trapped in this place, her own face distorted and twisted like the figures she had encountered. "No," Liz whispered, shaking her head. "That's not me. That's not my fate." The figure stopped, its head tilting as if considering her words. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, it raised a hand and pointed toward the hole. Liz didn't want to look, but her body moved against her will. She crawled to the edge and peered into the darkness. What she saw made her blood run cold. Below, countless figures writhed in agony, their faces contorted in eternal screams. They reached upward, their hands clawing at the air as if trying to escape. Among them, she saw a figure that looked eerily like herself, its eyes wide with terror. Liz recoiled, her stomach churning. "This isn't real," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It can't be real." The figure before her stepped closer, its presence oppressive. "You wanted the truth," it said. "Now you are part of it." With a sudden, violent force, the ground beneath Liz cracked. She tried to crawl away, but the stone gave way, and she was falling into the abyss. The last thing she saw was the recorder, resting on the edge, its red light still blinking. Then, darkness consumed her. The sensation of falling was unlike anything Liz had experienced. It wasn't merely physical, it felt as though her very essence was being pulled downward, spiraling into a void that defied logic and comprehension. Around her, The air grew colder, sharper, slicing against her skin like the edges of shattered glass. The chanting returned, louder and more oppressive, surrounding her in an unrelenting symphony of despair. Words she couldn't understand, archaic and guttural, filled the space, their meaning lost to her but their intent unmistakable. These were words of summoning, of power, and of ancient curses. As Liz hurtled downward, faint images began to take shape in the swirling darkness. She glimpsed fleeting scenes, moments frozen in time, like fragments of memories that didn't belong to her. A young girl chained to a wall, her eyes wide with terror as a figure loomed over her. A man pleading for mercy as he was dragged into the shadows. An entire room consumed by fire, the screams of the trapped echoing endlessly. The faces of the enslaved stared at her, their expressions a mixture of sorrow and fury. They seemed to reach for her, their translucent hands passing through her body as though she were a phantom in their world. Each touch sent a jolt of cold through her veins, a reminder of their torment. Liz tried to close her eyes, to block out the horrors surrounding her, but it was futile. The images weren't merely external, they were inside her mind, etched into her consciousness like scars. Suddenly, the falling stopped. Liz found herself standing, or rather, suspended on a surface that felt solid yet looked like an endless expanse of rippling darkness. Her legs trembled, and she collapsed to her knees, her hands clutching at the strange, shifting ground. Before her, the figure from the mirror materialized once more. This time, it was not alone. Dozens of similar entities surrounded her, their hollow eyes fixed on her with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. "You shouldn't have come," one of them intoned, its voice a low, resonant growl. Liz forced herself to her feet, her voice cracking as she replied, "I didn't come to harm anyone. I'm just here for the truth." The figures exchanged glances, or what passed for glances among beings without eyes. Then, they parted, creating a path that led to a towering set of iron gates that had appeared in the distance. The gates were adorned with grotesque carvings of faces twisted in agony, their eyes hollow and accusing. The lead figure gestured toward the gates. "The truth lies beyond. But you must decide, will you face it, or will you turn back?" Liz's heart pounded. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to turn away from this madness and never look back. But she knew she couldn't. She had come too far, risked too much. Summoning every ounce of courage, she stepped forward. The figures watched in silence as she approached the gates, their presence a suffocating reminder of what lay ahead. The gates creaked open with a sound that resonated deep within her chest, like the groan of an ancient beast awakening from slumber. Beyond them was a vast chamber, its walls lined with more of the grotesque carvings. In the center of the chamber stood a massive throne, its surface black and glistening like polished obsidian. Sitting on the throne was a figure unlike any she had seen before. It was humanoid in shape but impossibly tall, its skin a shimmering, iridescent black that seemed to absorb the light around it. Its eyes glowed a piercing white, and its elongated fingers tapped rhythmically against the armrests of the throne. The air grew heavier with each step Liz took, as though the very atmosphere was pressing down on her. She stopped a few feet from the throne, her knees threatening to buckle under the weight of its occupant's gaze. "You seek answers," the figure said, its voice echoing in the vast chamber. Liz nodded, her throat too dry to speak. The figure leaned forward, its glowing eyes narrowing. "Truth is not given, it is earned. And the cost is always greater than you expect." A wave of energy surged through the room, forcing Liz to her knees. She clutched her head as images flooded her mind once more. This time, they were more vivid, more personal. She saw herself as a child, exploring dusty libraries, her love for history blossoming. She saw the faces of the people she had lost, the moments of pain and regret she had buried deep within. And then she saw herself in the mansion, trapped in this very room, her face twisted and gaunt, just like the reflection in the mirror. "No," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "That's not my fate. That's not who I am." The figure on the throne chuckled, a sound that was both mocking and filled with ancient sorrow. Fate is not so easily denied, Elizabeth Harrington. You have tied yourself to this place, to its history and its curse. The question is, will you survive it? The ground beneath Liz began to crack, the polished surface splintering into fragments. She tried to stand, but the force of the energy in the room held her down. You wanted the truth, the figure said, its voice rising to a deafening roar. Now you will live it. The chamber erupted in chaos. The walls seemed to close in, the grotesque carvings coming to life and screaming in unison. Liz felt herself being pulled downward once more, into the same abyss she had thought she had escaped. As she fell, the last thing she saw was the figure on the throne, its glowing eyes watching her with an expression that was almost pitying. And then, there was nothing but darkness. Liz felt her very breath being pulled from her lungs as the shadows around her grew more oppressive. Her mind screamed for her to run, but her legs felt rooted to the ground, weighed down by the sheer force of the oppressive energy surrounding her. Her hands trembled as she clutched the edges of the desk, the glowing symbols from the book searing themselves into her consciousness. The words of the shadow entity rang in her ears, "You sought the truth. Now, you will become part of it." Desperation coursed through her veins as she clawed at the air, struggling to break free from the invisible grasp. She thought of her meticulous research, the countless nights spent piecing together the fragmented history of the Lalaurie mansion. Was this the truth she had been chasing all along? A truth not meant for mortal comprehension? Through her terror, Liz noticed a peculiar movement among the shadows. The entity's swirling forms began to flicker, as if struggling to maintain their cohesion. The green glow of the candle sputtered and dimmed, casting the room into a strange, undulating darkness. Something had disrupted its grasp, a disturbance Liz could not yet comprehend. Out of the corner of her eye, she spotted a faint shimmer of light emanating from the farthest corner of the library. Turning her head, she saw what appeared to be a small, antique mirror hanging crookedly on the wall. Its surface was cracked and tarnished, yet it seemed to hum with a faint energy, like a heartbeat just beneath its surface. Was this an escape? Or another trap? Liz could feel the pull of the entity lessening as her attention focused on the mirror. Without a moment's hesitation, she broke free from the desk, stumbling toward the mirror as the entity let out a guttural howl. "No!" the voices roared. "You will not leave." The shadows surged toward her, their movements frantic and chaotic. Liz reached out, her fingers brushing the cold, dusty surface of the mirror. The instant her skin made contact, a jolt of electricity shot through her body, and the world around her shattered like glass. She was falling plunging into a void filled with flashes of memories that weren't hers. Images of tortured souls, firelit chambers, and endless cries of anguish surrounded her, their echoes piercing her very soul. She saw the faces of Madame Delphine Lalaurie's victims, their expressions etched with unbearable pain. She heard their whispers, fragmented words filled with desperation and rage. And then, a voice gentle yet commanding cut through the cacophony. "You cannot rewrite what has been written. But you can carry the story forward." Liz opened her eyes, gasping as she found herself lying on the cold stone floor of the library. The room was eerily silent, the shadows gone, and the book on the desk now lay closed, its cover blank and unassuming. The mirror on the wall was shattered, its shards scattered across the floor. Shaking, she pulled herself to her feet and stumbled toward the door. The mansion seemed to shift around her, its oppressive energy retreating like a tide. For the first time, she felt as though she might actually escape. But as she reached the front hall, she froze. The main door was ajar, revealing the faint glow of morning light beyond. Relief washed over her as she took a step forward until she heard the faintest whisper from behind her. "Leaving so soon?" She turned, her heart hammering in her chest. The hallway stretched endlessly before her, its walls lined with portraits she hadn't noticed before. Each frame contained a face, their eyes following her every movement. One of the portraits, a woman with dark, piercing eyes and a cruel smile, seemed to move. The painted lips parted, and a chilling voice echoed in the empty hall. "You thought you uncovered the truth, but this mansion holds truths beyond your imagination. You belong to us now, historian. Tell our story, or become part of it forever." The door behind her slammed shut, plunging the mansion into darkness once more. Liz's breath hitched as the oppressive darkness returned, heavier and more suffocating than before. The voice from the portrait lingered in the air, reverberating through her skull like the echo of a distant storm. Her grip tightened around the strap of her satchel, where her notes and recorder were stored. For a fleeting moment, she considered the value of her research versus the growing possibility that she might never leave this place alive. The hallway seemed to stretch unnaturally, the portraits lining the walls growing larger, their frames twisting grotesquely as if the walls themselves were alive. Each face in the paintings shifted slightly, their expressions warping from neutral gazes to sinister smirks and hollow-eyed stares. One portrait caught her attention, a young girl with sunken cheeks and hollow eyes. The girl's lips moved, forming silent words that Liz instinctively understood. "Run." Liz stumbled backward, her knees trembling. The air grew colder with each passing second, frost creeping along the wooden floorboards and licking at her ankles. Her breath formed icy clouds, and the sound of her heartbeat thundered in her ears. She turned to the door, now firmly shut. Panic surged through her as she clawed at the handle, pulling and twisting it with all her might. But the door wouldn't budge. It was as though the mansion itself had decided she would not leave. A sharp noise like the cracking of wood echoed behind her. Liz froze, her hands still gripping the unyielding handle. Slowly, she turned her head. The portraits were no longer confined to their frames. The figures within them were stepping out, their bodies stretching and distorting as they emerged into the hallway. The young girl was the first to fully materialize, her feet barely touching the ground as she floated closer, her tattered dress swaying in an invisible breeze. Behind her, other figures followed, men and women in outdated clothing, their faces etched with pain, anger, and a desperate hunger. "You wanted the truth," the girl whispered, her voice soft yet piercing. "Now, it will consume you." The figures surged toward her like a wave, their hands outstretched. Liz screamed and bolted down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. She didn't know where she was running, only that she had to get away. The mansion shifted around her, the walls bending and twisting as though mocking her every move. Doors appeared and disappeared, leading to nowhere. The sound of her pursuers grew louder, their distorted voices calling her name in unison. "Lies." Her legs burned as she rounded a corner, only to skid to a halt. She had reached the library again. The room was completely transformed. The bookshelves were now empty, their contents scattered across the floor in a chaotic mess. The desk where she had found the cursed book was overturned, and the book itself lay open in the center of the room, its pages glowing faintly. Liz hesitated, her gaze fixed on the book. Something about it called to her, a strange pull she couldn't resist. The voices behind her grew louder, their presence pressing against her like a physical weight. Without thinking, she darted to the desk and grabbed the book. The instant her fingers touched the pages, the glowing light enveloped her. She felt herself being pulled again, the world around her dissolving into a swirling vortex of shadows and light. When the chaos subsided, she found herself standing in a dimly lit room she didn't recognize. The walls were lined with shelves filled with jars containing unidentifiable, grotesque objects. Chains hung from the ceiling, their ends stained with rust or perhaps blood. In the center of the room stood a figure. Liz's heart sank as she realized who it was, Madame Delphine Lalaurie herself. The infamous woman was eerily beautiful, her pale skin glowing faintly in the dim light. She wore a lavish gown, its fabric flowing like liquid shadow. Her eyes cold and calculating fixed on Liz with a mix of curiosity and amusement. "So," Lalaurie said, her voice smooth and lilting, "Another curious soul. You are not the first, and you will not be the last." Liz tried to speak, but no words came out. Her throat felt constricted, as if invisible hands were choking her. Lalaurie stepped closer, her footsteps silent despite the chains that seemed to rattle with every move. "You wanted to uncover my story, did you not? You should have been careful what you wished for. The truth is a burden few can bear." She raised a hand, and the book in Liz's grasp flew from her fingers, landing in Lalaurie's palm. The woman flipped through its pages, her expression unreadable. "You cannot leave," Lalaurie continued, her tone chillingly casual. "This house keeps what it claims. But perhaps you can be of use to me." Liz's vision blurred as a strange pressure built in her skull. Her thoughts felt muddled, her memories slipping away like sand through her fingers. She clutched her head, gasping for air. Lalaurie's voice echoed in her mind, "You wanted to document history. Now, you will live it." The room began to dissolve into darkness once more, and Liz felt herself fading, her very essence being absorbed into the mansion. The last thing she saw was Lalaurie's cold smile, and the last thing she heard was her own voice, now part of the chorus of whispers haunting the mansion. Liz's consciousness wavered in the void, trapped between reality and the mansion's sinister grasp. She could feel the essence of the house wrapping around her, binding her in ways she could neither see nor fully comprehend. Yet, somewhere in the depths of her fading awareness, a faint, defiant spark ignited a refusal to be consumed without a fight. As Lalaurie's cruel laughter echoed in her mind, Liz realized that she was not entirely alone. Other voices, distinct and fragmented, whispered in the background. Some were pleading, others angry, but one stood out, a calm, steady voice that cut through the chaos like a beacon. "You can fight this," it said, clear and authoritative. "But you must remember who you are." The memory of her work, her passion for uncovering the truth, flickered through Liz's mind like a dying flame. It was enough to ground her, if only slightly. With great effort, she focused on the book Lalaurie had taken. "The book is the key," the voice whispered, and Liz clung to the thought as if it were a lifeline. Suddenly, she was no longer in the dark void but back in the mansion, standing in the library once more. The room had reverted to its original form, books neatly shelved, the air eerily still. Liz looked down and found the cursed book back in her hands, its pages blank and waiting. She felt the house watching her, its presence heavier than ever. The walls seemed to breathe, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, though no one was there. Liz realized this wasn't just a haunted house, it was a living entity, feeding on those who dared to seek its secrets. As her mind raced, she noticed something new about the book. Hidden symbols began to materialize on its pages, faint and glowing. The voice from before returned, softer now but still insistent. "This book holds the truth," it said. "But to reveal it, you must give something in return. Are you willing to sacrifice to escape?" Liz hesitated, the weight of the question sinking in. Her hands trembled as she turned the pages, the symbols shifting into words. They described not only the history of the Lalaurie mansion but also the fates of those who had tried to uncover its mysteries. Each story ended the same way: entrapment, suffering, and eventual erasure. But Liz's name wasn't listed. Not yet. She realized she still had a chance to break free, but the cost was steep. To escape, she would need to release someone or something else in her place. A wave of guilt washed over her as she considered the implications. Could she trade her freedom for another soul, even one already lost within the mansion? Before she could decide, the room shifted again, the air growing colder. Lalaurie reappeared, her presence suffocating. "You cannot outwit this house," she sneered, her voice dripping with malice. "It is eternal, as am I. Your story ends here." But Liz, emboldened by the mysterious voice, refused to cower. "This house may have claimed others, but I'm not like them. I came here to document history, not to be erased by it. If you're eternal, Lalaurie, then you're bound by rules that I can break. Lalaurie's expression faltered for the briefest moment, and Liz seized the opportunity. She opened the book to its center, where the symbols glowed brightest. The voice guided her hands, instructing her to trace the symbols with her fingers. The room trembled violently, books flying off the shelves and the air filling with a deafening roar. Liz screamed as light poured from the book, engulfing everything in its path. Lalaurie's form twisted and contorted, her screams mingling with the chaos. And then, silence. Liz found herself on the front steps of the mansion, the morning sun breaking over the horizon. The book was gone, as was her satchel. Her body ached, and her mind felt heavy with the weight of what she had experienced. She looked back at the mansion, its windows dark and lifeless. For a moment, she thought she had escaped the clutches of the cursed house. But as she turned to leave, she noticed something strange. Her reflection in the window didn't move with her. It stood still, watching her with hollow eyes. And then it smiled. Liz took a steadying breath and stepped through the threshold of the mansion, the ornate double doors groaning shut behind her with a finality that sent a shiver down her spine. She adjusted her bag, packed with high-tech equipment and a journal brimming with historical notes on Madame Lalaurie. Her flashlight's beam swept over the room, illuminating decayed furniture, cracked mirrors, and walls covered in peeling wallpaper. Despite her academic resolve, the oppressive atmosphere of the mansion weighed on her like a heavy cloak. Each creak of the floorboards, each faint rustle of fabric, made her pause and glance over her shoulder. "This house is just old," Liz muttered to herself, though the words did little to banish her unease. "There's nothing here that can't be explained." She began her investigation in the grand parlor, where rumors of Lalaurie's lavish parties had once echoed through the walls. Liz methodically documented the space, noting the intricate woodwork and faded elegance. The air was colder here, her breath visible in the beam of her flashlight. Her thermal camera buzzed to life, scanning the room for anomalies. The device showed faint traces of handprints on the walls, large and small, as if several people had pressed their hands there long ago. Liz frowned. The prints were too distinct to be remnants of the past, and their positions didn't make sense. Some were far too high for any normal person to reach. She took out her EVP recorder and set it on the dusty mantel. "If there's anyone here," Liz said, her voice steady despite the tension coiling in her stomach, "please make your presence known." The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant groan of settling wood. Liz was about to move on when the recorder emitted a faint crackle. She played back the audio and froze. The recording captured her question, followed by a raspy, whispering voice. "Why have you come?" Liz's pulse quickened. She played the clip again, straining to catch every nuance of the eerie response. This wasn't her first brush with EVP phenomena, but there was something unsettlingly direct about the voice. Brushing aside her nerves, Liz pressed deeper into the mansion. Her footsteps echoed as she ascended the grand staircase, the ornate banisters still bearing claw marks from the fire that had ravaged the house decades ago. The historian in her marveled at the craftsmanship, but the chill in the air became more pronounced the higher she climbed. On the second floor, Liz entered what had once been Madame Lalaurie's private quarters. The room was eerily preserved, as if its occupant might return at any moment. Her flashlight caught the glint of a cracked mirror above a vanity, its edges darkened by time. She aimed her thermal camera at the mirror and saw a faint outline like a figure standing just behind her. Spinning around, Liz found nothing but the empty room. She turned back to the mirror, but the outline was gone. "Just a trick of the light," she whispered, trying to reassure herself. As night fell, the mansion seemed to come alive. Doors creaked open on their own, cold spots appeared and vanished, and Liz's EMF detector spiked repeatedly, the readings jumping into the red. Each anomaly she documented only fueled her determination to uncover the truth. In Madame Lalaurie's dressing room, Liz experienced her most vivid and terrifying encounter yet. As she swept her flashlight across the room, her vision blurred, and for a brief moment, she saw a chilling scene: Madame Lalaurie, her once elegant dress soaked in blood, dragging a terrified victim toward a hidden passage. Liz staggered back, gasping as the vision faded. Her EMF detector buzzed wildly, its readings off the charts. This can't be real," Liz stammered, though the historian in her clung to the possibility of uncovering something monumental. Compelled by the vision, Liz examined the walls, searching for any sign of a hidden passage. Her fingers brushed against a cracked section of the mirror, which gave way under her touch. Behind it was a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Her heart raced, torn between fear and professional curiosity. "This could be it," she whispered. "The key to everything." Summoning her courage, Liz switched on her flashlight and began her descent. Liz stared at the narrow staircase revealed behind the mirror, the darkness within seeming to stretch infinitely. The air wafting out was damp and carried the faint metallic tang of rust, or was it blood? Her historian's instinct wrestled with her survival instincts. "This could be the discovery of a lifetime," she muttered, her trembling hand gripping the flashlight. As she stepped onto the first creaking stair, a low whisper rippled through the room. It wasn't picked up by her EVP recorder this time. It was loud, tangible, like a voice brushing directly against her ear. "He waits for you." Liz froze, her breath caught in her throat. She whipped around, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the gloom, but the dressing room was as empty as when she'd entered. Her equipment wasn't registering anything unusual, but the unmistakable feeling of being watched prickled at her neck. Determined, Liz descended further. The staircase curved in odd, unsettling angles, as if the passage had been haphazardly carved out. Each step she took seemed to echo too loudly, the sound magnified and distorted until it resembled the dragging of chains. At the bottom, her flashlight illuminated a small, hidden chamber. The walls were bare stone, stained with streaks of reddish-brown, and in the center stood a rusted iron chair bolted to the floor. Shackles hung loosely from the armrests, their edges worn smooth from centuries of use. Liz approached cautiously, her mind racing. She had read accounts of Madame Lalaurie's cruelty, but seeing tangible evidence like this was a different beast entirely. She set her camera to record, documenting every detail. "This must have been a torture chamber," she whispered to herself, her voice shaky. As Liz circled the room, the air grew heavier, pressing against her chest. Her EMF detector spiked wildly, emitting sharp, erratic beeps. Her thermal camera, set on the chair, revealed a faint but unmistakable heat signature, as if someone had just been sitting there. Then came the voices. First, faint whispers, indistinct but undeniably human. They grew louder, overlapping in a chaotic chorus. Cries of pain, desperate pleas, and guttural sobs filled the chamber. Liz clapped her hands over her ears, but the sounds seemed to come from inside her own mind. "No," she murmured, backing away. "This isn't real. This isn't real." Her retreat brought her against the far wall, where her shoulder brushed against a protruding stone. The entire panel shifted with a grating sound, revealing another narrow corridor. Against her better judgment, Liz stepped inside, drawn by an inexplicable compulsion. The corridor opened into a larger chamber, dimly lit by a single, flickering lantern hanging from the ceiling. On a makeshift altar in the center lay an open book, its pages filled with intricate diagrams and ancient script. Liz recognized some of the symbols from her research. They were occult markings tied to rituals of binding and summoning. She leaned closer, her flashlight illuminating a specific passage. Her breath hitched as she translated the faded text. "By their blood, they remain bound, by their torment, they sustain the curse." A sudden gust extinguished her flashlight, plunging the room into near darkness. The lantern flickered violently before going out entirely. Liz fumbled for her backup light, but before she could switch it on, the chamber was bathed in an unnatural red glow. The shadows on the walls began to shift, elongating and merging into grotesque forms. Liz's pulse thundered in her ears as she watched one shadow detach from the wall, solidifying into a figure. It was a man tall, with hollow eyes and a twisted sneer. His clothes were tattered, his face bearing burns and scars. Liz recognized him from historical sketches, Jean, one of Lalaurie's most infamous victims. "You shouldn't have come," the apparition rasped, his voice a blend of sorrow and rage. Before Liz could react, the other shadows began to move, their forms grotesque and incomplete. Some had missing limbs, others bore the unmistakable marks of torture. They crowded the chamber, their anguished cries filling the air. Liz stumbled back, her camera capturing everything even as her mind struggled to comprehend it. The ghostly figures didn't attack but circled her, their hollow eyes accusing, pleading. "Why are you still here?" Liz shouted, her voice breaking. "What do you want from me?" Jean's shadow loomed closer, his face inches from hers. "We cannot leave," he said, his voice a whisper that resonated through the room. "Not while she still watches." Liz's flashlight flickered back on, and the chamber was empty once more. The altar, the book, the lantern all gone. Only the oppressive silence remained. Her instincts screamed at her to flee, but the historian in her wouldn't allow it. Somewhere in this mansion lay the answers she sought, the reason behind the hauntings, the truth of the curse. As she turned to leave, the shadows stirred again, just out of sight. One whisper followed her up the staircase, chilling her to the bone. "She knows you're here." Liz ascended the staircase, her legs trembling, her mind racing with the words the shadowy figure had whispered. "She knows you're here." Her historian's training warred with the primal fear clawing at her chest. Who was she? Madame Lalaurie? Or something far more sinister? The air seemed denser now, every breath carrying an oppressive weight. Liz clutched her journal tightly, scribbling fragmented notes as she reached the dressing room above. But something was different, the space felt alive. The mirror she had moved earlier now stood upright, its cracked surface gleaming as though freshly polished. She approached cautiously, her flashlight casting warped reflections. As she leaned in, her own image distorted, her eyes sunken, her mouth twisted in a silent scream. She stumbled back, nearly dropping her flashlight. When she looked again, the mirror reflected only the empty room behind her. A low thud echoed from the corridor she had come through. Liz froze, her pulse hammering in her ears. The sound repeated, rhythmic and deliberate, like footsteps approaching. Her flashlight flickered, plunging the room into darkness for a split second. When the light returned, the mirror was shattered on the floor, its shards forming the outline of a grotesque face. "Get a grip," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You're letting your mind play tricks on you." But as she turned to gather her equipment, her thermal camera began to beep erratically. She picked it up, the screen revealing another heat signature, this one pacing just outside the doorway. The footsteps grew louder. Liz clutched her EVP recorder, her voice trembling as she called out, "Who's there?" The footsteps stopped. Silence hung heavy in the air. Then, a whisper, so close it felt like someone was breathing against her ear, "Why do you seek the dead?" Liz spun around, but no one was there. Her camera caught movement, a fleeting figure darting across the room. She aimed her flashlight at the corner, only to find an old trunk she hadn't noticed before. Its leather surface was cracked and faded, but the lock gleamed, as if it had been recently handled. Curiosity overpowered fear. Liz knelt beside the trunk, her hands shaking as she pried it open. Inside were faded garments, brittle with age, and a bundle of yellowed papers. She carefully unfolded one sheet, the writing barely legible in the dim light. The letter was addressed to Madame Lalaurie herself, written in frantic, looping script. "You cannot continue this. The spirits grow restless. They demand justice, and their torment will not be silenced. You are cursed, Delphine, and so shall be this house. Liz's breath hitched. This was a tangible piece of history, a direct connection to the horrors she'd only read about. But before she could examine the papers further, a loud crash reverberated through the mansion, shaking the floor beneath her. The dressing room door slammed shut. Liz ran to it, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping in a cacophony of anger and sorrow. She grabbed her camera, desperate to document what was happening. The lens revealed figures forming in the shadows, distorted, skeletal shapes clawing their way toward her. The EVP recorder blared with static before a single voice cut through, clear and commanding. You must leave now or be consumed. Liz's determination wavered, but something in the shadows caught her eye. A faint light glimmered beneath the far wall, emanating from a hidden crevice. She approached cautiously, her hand brushing against the surface. The wall gave way, revealing a hidden passage she hadn't seen before. The light drew her in, growing brighter as she descended into another layer of the mansion. The air was colder here, each breath visible in the dim glow of her flashlight. She emerged into a cavernous chamber lined with rows of rusted cages. Inside each, skeletal remains clung to the bars, their positions twisted in agony. In the center of the room stood a single figure, a woman, her back turned. Her dress was elegant but tattered, her hair pinned in a style centuries old. Liz's heart froze as realization dawned. This was no ghostly figure, this was her. Madame Lalaurie. Liz's voice was barely a whisper. The woman turned slowly, revealing a face far worse than any historical sketch had captured. Her features were hollow, her skin stretched tightly over her skull. Blood dripped from her hands, pooling at her feet. Her lips curled into a malevolent smile. You sought the truth, she said, her voice a chilling melody. Now, you will become part of it. Before Liz could react, the cages rattled violently, their doors creaking open. The skeletal remains began to move, dragging themselves toward her. Liz stumbled back, dropping her camera. Her flashlight flickered as the shadows closed in, and the last thing she saw was Madame Lalaurie's outstretched hand, her nails sharp and glinting. The camera continued to record, its lens capturing the horrific scene as Liz's screams echoed through the chamber. Above, in the dressing room, the shattered mirror slowly began to reassemble itself, the cracks forming the outline of Liz's terrified face. As Liz stood frozen in the chamber, the oppressive darkness seemed to take on a life of its own. The skeletal figures that had stirred moments ago began to convulse, their joints snapping into grotesque configurations as they dragged themselves closer. The air grew colder with every breath, each exhalation clouding in front of her. She fumbled for her flashlight, the beam weak and flickering. The once faint whispers around her swelled into a chaotic din. It wasn't just one voice now, it was many. Screams of pain, desperate cries for mercy, and guttural growls overlapped, each voice telling its own story of torment. The walls of the chamber, previously stone and decayed wood, now shifted. Images of faces anguished, twisted, and pleading emerged from the surfaces, their mouths moving as if trying to speak. Liz stared in horror as one face, that of a young girl, turned toward her. She won't let you leave, the girl mouthed silently. Liz backed away, clutching her journal to her chest as if it were a talisman. The cold seeped into her bones, numbing her hands. Desperation overpowered reason. She turned and ran, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous room. The skeletal figures didn't pursue her but seemed to laugh, their hollow eye sockets following her every move. As she approached the hidden passage, a chilling realization struck her: the opening was gone. The wall that had shifted before was solid once more, as if the mansion itself was sealing her fate. Her breathing grew ragged, her pulse pounding in her ears. She spun around, searching for another escape, only to see the room stretching endlessly behind her. The cages seemed to multiply, rows upon rows of rusted bars materializing from the darkness. In her panic, Liz tripped over something soft. She landed hard, her flashlight skittering across the floor and plunging her into near total darkness. She reached out blindly, her fingers brushing against fabric. When she pulled her hand back, it was sticky, coated in blood. She scrambled to her knees, groping for her flashlight. The beam flickered back on, illuminating what she had fallen over, a decayed body in 19th century attire, its lifeless eyes staring into hers. The corpse's hand was outstretched, clutching a locket. Against her better judgment, Liz pried the locket free. Inside was a tiny portrait of Madame Lalaurie and a man she didn't recognize. Beneath the portrait, scrawled in faded ink, were the words, "Bound by blood, cursed by sin." Liz's historian instincts kicked in despite her terror. This wasn't just a haunting, this was a curse, rooted in something darker than she'd imagined. The mansion wasn't merely a vessel for restless spirits, it was a living, breathing entity feeding on the pain it had housed for centuries. Suddenly, the locket grew hot in her hand, searing her palm. She cried out, dropping it. The chamber responded as if angered walls groaned, the floor buckled, and the skeletal figures began to rise once more. From behind her, a voice rang out, clear and commanding. "You shouldn't have taken it." Liz spun around to see a figure emerging from the shadows. It was the woman from the earlier vision, Madame Lalaurie herself. But this time, there was no fleeting glimpse. She stood fully formed, her once beautiful face twisted by centuries of malice. "You sought the truth, didn't you?" Lalaurie's voice was venomous yet eerily calm. She stepped closer, her bloodied hands reaching out. "You wanted to know my secrets. But knowledge comes at a price." Liz stumbled back, clutching her journal as if it could shield her. "You can't hurt me," she stammered. "You're just a ghost." Lalaurie finished mockingly, her smile widening. "I am so much more than that. I am this house. And now, you are mine." The skeletal figures surged forward, their laughter echoing through the chamber. Liz turned to run, but her path was blocked by more cages materializing from the darkness. The mansion was closing in on her, its walls shifting to trap her. In a last-ditch effort, Liz grabbed her EVP recorder and screamed into it, "If anyone finds this, get out. Don't come here." But her voice was drowned out by a deafening roar. The chamber itself seemed to inhale, drawing Liz toward its center. The skeletal figures reached for her, their hands tearing at her clothes, her journal, her very sense of reality. The last thing Liz saw before everything went black was Madame Lalaurie's face, her smile triumphant as she whispered, "Welcome home." Above, in the mansion's grand hall, the oppressive silence was shattered by a faint knock at the front door. The sound reverberated through the decaying walls, as if the house itself was stirring in anticipation. A single beam of moonlight filtered through the crack-stained glass window above the entrance, illuminating the thick layer of dust and cobwebs coating the floor. The massive double doors creaked as they slowly opened, seemingly of their own accord, revealing a lone figure standing on the threshold. The visitor, a man named Ethan Crow, hesitated briefly, his silhouette framed by the dim glow of the street lamp outside. Ethan was a freelance journalist turned paranormal investigator, known for his unrelenting pursuit of the unexplained. In his hand, he clutched a leather-bound notebook filled with scribbled accounts of haunted places and bizarre occurrences. The Lalaurie mansion was supposed to be just another entry in his book, another mystery to unravel. But this house felt different. Ethan stepped inside, his boots crunching on the brittle remains of what looked like shattered porcelain. The air was thick and heavy, carrying the faint scent of decay. His eyes scanned the vast hall, taking in the faded grandeur. A massive, dust-covered chandelier hung precariously above, and ornate mirrors adorned the walls, their surfaces tarnished and warped. He felt a chill, though the night outside had been unusually warm. It wasn't the kind of cold that came with winter air, it was deeper, almost alive, seeping into his bones. Ethan cleared his throat, his voice echoing unnaturally. "Hello? Is anyone here?" No response. He glanced down at his phone, its screen glowing faintly as he checked the time. The signal bar was empty. Typical, he thought, pocketing the device. Reaching into his bag, he pulled out a digital recorder and pressed the record button. "This is Ethan Crow, November 20th. Time 10:47 p.m. I've just entered the infamous Lalaurie mansion. The atmosphere here is oppressive. It feels like the house is watching me. Let's see what secrets it holds." He set the recorder on a nearby table, its tiny red light blinking steadily, and began his exploration. Ethan didn't believe in ghosts, not entirely. To him, every haunting had an explanation, whether it was psychological suggestion, structural anomalies, or simply a good story passed down and twisted over time. Yet, the accounts tied to this mansion unsettled him. The stories of Madame Delphine Lalaurie's cruelty, the disappearances, and the sightings of shadowy figures were well documented. Locals claimed that no one who stepped inside the mansion after dark came out the same or came out at all. Ethan dismissed these tales as exaggerated urban legends, but standing there now, he wasn't so sure. He took a deep breath and pressed on, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. His footsteps echoed hollowly, each creak of the wooden floorboards seeming unnaturally loud. As he passed one of the large mirrors, he paused, catching a fleeting movement out of the corner of his eye. He turned sharply, the flashlight illuminating the empty hall behind him. Nothing. Just shadows dancing on the walls, the product of his own movement. He shook his head and muttered under his breath, "Get a grip, Crow." As he ascended the grand staircase, he felt an unshakable sensation of being watched. The back of his neck prickled, and he resisted the urge to look over his shoulder. Upstairs, the air grew colder still. The doors lining the hallway were tightly shut, but one stood slightly ajar, its frame warped with age. Ethan approached cautiously, pushing it open to reveal a small sitting room. Dust-covered furniture sat untouched, and a large window overlooked the courtyard below. On the far wall, a portrait hung crookedly. It depicted a regal woman with piercing eyes, Madame Lalaurie herself. Her painted gaze seemed to follow him as he crossed the room. Ethan approached the painting, his flashlight revealing something unusual, faint scratches at the bottom of the frame, as if someone had tried to claw their way through the wall beneath it. His curiosity piqued, he reached out to adjust the painting, and it swung open like a door, revealing a dark, narrow passageway. He froze, staring into the abyss. The faintest sound drifted from within, a child's laughter, distant and hollow. "Time to see where this rabbit hole leads," he whispered, gripping his flashlight tightly. With a mix of trepidation and excitement, Ethan stepped into the passageway, unaware that the mansion had already begun to claim him. Ethan moved cautiously down the narrow passageway, his flashlight beam flickering intermittently. The walls were close, almost suffocating, their wooden panels warped and cracked with age. He ran his fingers along them, noticing deep grooves etched into the surface like desperate claw marks. The laughter he'd heard earlier was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press against his ears. Every step he took echoed, each sound magnified as though the mansion itself was amplifying his presence. Ethan whispered into his recorder, his voice steady but low. "I've uncovered a hidden passageway behind a portrait of Madame Lalaurie. The air here feels heavier, denser. There are scratches on the walls, as if someone tried to escape. I'll proceed further." The passage sloped downward, and the air grew colder with every step. The faint scent of mildew mixed with something else, something metallic. Blood. Ethan shook off the thought, chalking it up to his imagination. Still, the hairs on his arms stood on end, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But turning back wasn't in his nature. The passage finally opened into a small chamber, dimly lit by a single, flickering gas lamp mounted on the wall. Ethan frowned. The lamp looked as though it had been lit recently, its glass cover free of dust or grime. "Impossible," he muttered, stepping closer to inspect it. He reached out a hand, hesitating as a faint shadow passed across the chamber. His flashlight darted upward, scanning the ceiling. Nothing. Then, a soft whisper, "Ethan." His heart raced. He spun around, the flashlight slicing through the darkness, but no one was there. His mind raced, trying to rationalize the voice. Could it have been the wind? The old house settling? "Ethan," the whisper came again, louder this time, unmistakable. It was a woman's voice, smooth and taunting. Ethan gripped his flashlight tighter, forcing himself to respond. "Who's there? Show yourself." Silence. The voice didn't come again, but the atmosphere in the chamber shifted. The cold intensified, and Ethan felt a weight settle on his chest. He took a step back, bumping into something solid. Whirling around, he found himself face to face with a large wooden door. The door was adorned with strange carving symbols he didn't recognize, etched deep into the wood. A rusted iron handle protruded from its center. Without thinking, Ethan placed a hand on it, only to recoil as a sharp jolt shot up his arm. "What the hell?" he muttered, shaking his hand. The symbols on the door seemed to glow faintly, their lines pulsing like veins beneath the surface. Ethan's curiosity burned brighter than his fear. He pulled a glove from his bag, slipped it on, and tried the handle again. This time, the door creaked open, revealing a staircase spiraling downward into pitch-black darkness. Ethan raised his flashlight, illuminating the first few steps. A chill ran through him as he noticed faint footprints in the thick dust barefoot, leading downward. "Who else has been down here?" he whispered into the recorder. "The footprints are fresh. They don't match any of the accounts I've read." Steeling himself, he began the descent. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the mansion itself were trying to pull him back. The air grew damp and thick, and the faint metallic scent returned, stronger this time. At the bottom of the staircase, he found himself in what appeared to be a small, underground room. The walls were lined with chains, their rusted links still anchored to the stone. Faint scratches and dark stains marred the floor. Ethan felt his breath catch in his throat. This is a holding cell," he said into the recorder. "A dungeon." As he scanned the room, his flashlight caught a figure in the corner, small, hunched, and shrouded in shadow. "Hello," Ethan called, his voice trembling. The figure didn't move. It remained still, as though carved from stone. Slowly, Ethan approached, his flashlight shaking in his grip. The figure came into focus, a mannequin, its porcelain face cracked and its lifeless eyes staring blankly ahead. It wore tattered clothing, stained with what looked like dried blood. Ethan exhaled sharply, relief washing over him. "Just a prop," he muttered. "Someone's sick idea of a scare tactic." But as he turned to leave, the mannequin's head slowly turned to face him, its cracked lips parting into a sinister grin. A sharp laugh echoed through the chamber, loud and guttural, as the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut. The flashlight flickered wildly, and Ethan stumbled backward, his recorder clattering to the floor. The laughter grew louder, echoing from every direction. Shadows stretched and twisted, taking on grotesque shapes that reached for him. Ethan tried to scream, but the sound caught in his throat. The last thing he saw before the flashlight died was the mannequin rising to its feet, its lifeless eyes burning with unnatural light. The mansion was alive, and it had claimed him. Ethan stumbled back, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The flashlight flickered one last time before plunging him into complete darkness. He groped for his recorder, his fingers trembling as he found the device. This isn't real," he whispered, his voice shaking. "It can't be real." The laughter subsided, replaced by a low, Guttural growl. It was deep and resonant, reverberating through the walls and floor. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs felt rooted in place. "Who's there?" he yelled, his voice echoing in the darkness. "Show yourself." A faint glow illuminated the room, emanating from the chains on the walls. The rusted links seemed to come alive, writhing like serpents. Ethan watched in horror as they began to uncoil and stretch toward him. "No, no, no," he muttered, backing away. His hands searched for anything he could use as a weapon, but the room was barren. The chains moved closer, their metallic clinking filling the space. One of them lashed out, narrowly missing Ethan's arm. He bolted toward the staircase, tripping over the uneven floor. As he scrambled to his feet, the faint glow from the chains illuminated the mannequin. It stood in the center of the room now, its cracked face staring directly at him. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, its voice a distorted echo. Ethan froze. His mind raced, trying to process what he was hearing. You're not real," he shouted. The mannequin tilted its head, the motion unnervingly human. "Neither are you," it replied. Before Ethan could react, the ground beneath him shifted. He felt himself falling, the floor opening up like a trapdoor. He tumbled through the darkness, his body twisting and turning as he descended into the unknown. When he finally hit solid ground, the impact knocked the wind out of him. He groaned, pain radiating through his limbs as he tried to sit up. He was in another chamber, larger than the last. The walls were lined with shelves, each one crammed with jars containing strange, unidentifiable substances. Some glowed faintly, casting eerie shadows across the room. In the center of the chamber stood a large table, its surface covered in ancient, yellowed papers and rusted tools. Ethan's eyes were drawn to a single object, a book bound in black leather, its cover embossed with symbols he couldn't decipher. Compelled by a force he couldn't explain, he approached the table. The air around the book seemed to hum with energy, pulling him closer. His hands shook as he reached out, brushing the surface of the leather cover. The moment he touched it, the room exploded with light. Images flashed before his eyes, scenes of torture and anguish, of Madame Lalaurie's twisted experiments and the unspeakable horrors she inflicted on her victims. He saw her face, her eyes cold and calculating, as she turned toward him. "You wanted the truth," her voice echoed in his mind. "Now you're part of it." Ethan screamed, pulling his hand away from the book. The vision stopped, but the room was no longer the same. The shelves were gone, replaced by walls covered in bloodied handprints. The jars had shattered, their contents pooling on the floor in sickly, glowing puddles. The book remained, but its cover now bore his name, etched in deep, crimson letters. "This isn't happening," Ethan whispered, backing away. "This can't be happening." The growl returned, louder and closer this time. Shadows began to gather in the corners of the room, coalescing into human-like forms. Their hollow eyes stared at Ethan, their mouths opening in silent screams. The staircase he'd fallen from was gone, replaced by a solid stone wall. He was trapped. Ethan clutched the recorder to his chest, his breaths coming in panicked gasps. "If anyone finds this, don't come here," he said, his voice breaking. "This place, it's alive. It won't let you leave." The shadows moved closer, their forms becoming more defined. Ethan could see their faces now twisted, contorted in agony. They reached for him, their fingers elongated and claw-like. As they closed in, Ethan's flashlight flickered back to life. In its beam, he saw a single figure standing among the shadows. It was himself. The other Ethan smiled, a cruel, mocking expression that sent chills down his spine. "Welcome home," it said, its voice identical to his own. The shadows engulfed him, their icy touch searing his skin. Ethan screamed, his voice swallowed by the darkness. The recorder fell to the floor, its red light still blinking. The chamber was silent once more, save for the faint sound of chains rattling in the distance. When Ethan's consciousness returned, he found himself lying on a cold, damp surface. The air was thick and heavy, reeking of decay and something metallic, blood, perhaps. His body ached, as though he'd been crushed under a great weight. He opened his eyes slowly, blinking against the dim, flickering light. The chamber was no longer the one he'd seen before. The walls were slick with a black, tar-like substance that oozed in slow rivulets. Strange symbols, glowing faintly, pulsed in rhythm with his own heartbeat. Ethan sat up with effort, his movements sluggish. His recorder lay on the ground a few feet away, its red light blinking weakly. He reached for it, clutching it like a lifeline. "I'm still here," he whispered into the device, his voice hoarse. "But I don't know where here is anymore." The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, slow, deliberate. Ethan froze, his pulse quickening. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until a shadow appeared in the corridor ahead. "Hello," he called out, his voice trembling. "Who's there?" The figure stepped into the faint light. It was a woman, her face obscured by a veil. Her dress was tattered and stained, but the air around her carried an air of authority. Ethan recognized her instantly from the countless portraits he'd studied. Madame Delphine Lalaurie. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice as cold as the chamber itself. Ethan stumbled backward, his mind racing. You're dead," he stammered. "Am I?" she asked, tilting her head. "Or am I exactly where I've always been?" She stepped closer, and Ethan felt the temperature drop with each step. His breath clouded in front of him as he tried to move, but his legs refused to obey. "You sought the truth, didn't you?" she continued, circling him like a predator stalking its prey. "So desperate to uncover my secrets. Tell me, Ethan, how far are you willing to go for knowledge?" Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I just wanted to understand," he said. "To document history." Lalaurie laughed, a sound that echoed unnaturally, filling the chamber. "History," she mocked. "You think this is history? This is my legacy. And now, you're a part of it." The symbols on the walls began to glow brighter, their pulsing rhythm quickening. Ethan felt a sharp pain in his chest, as though something was being pulled from him. "Stop," he cried out, clutching at his heart. Lalaurie leaned in, her face inches from his. For the first time, Ethan could see her eyes, dark, empty voids that seemed to pull him in. "You can leave, if you wish," she said softly. "But the question is, who will you be when you do?" Before he could respond, the ground beneath him shifted. He was falling again, the air rushing past him as he descended into an even deeper abyss. Ethan paced the room, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and terror. The mirror's reflection still haunted him, the stranger's face staring back, lips moving in time with his own words. "Lalaurie," he muttered, gripping the edge of a desk. "What did you do to me?" The mansion seemed to answer in its own way. A faint whisper snaked through the air, a voice neither male nor female but chillingly familiar. "You're not alone." Ethan froze, his eyes darting around the room. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. He followed the sound, opening the heavy door and stepping into the corridor. As he walked, the walls appeared to shift, the ornate wallpaper peeling away to reveal splintered wood beneath. His footsteps echoed unnaturally, as though the mansion were amplifying his presence. Then, he heard it, a faint, desperate cry. "Hello," he called out, his voice trembling. The cry came again, louder this time. Ethan broke into a run, following the sound down a winding staircase that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. When he reached the bottom, he found himself in a vast underground chamber. The air was damp and suffocating, the floor littered with debris and fragments of shattered glass. And there, in the center of the room, was Liz. She was huddled against the wall, clutching a journal to her chest. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She looked up as Ethan approached, recognition dawning in her expression. "You," she whispered. "You're real." Ethan knelt beside her, his heart pounding. "I don't know how real I am anymore," he said. "Are you Liz?" "The investigator?" She nodded weakly. "I thought I was the only one left." As Ethan helped Liz to her feet, she clutched his arm tightly. "We have to get out of here," she said. "This place, it changes you. It's already started with me." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Liz hesitated, then rolled up her sleeve to reveal a series of blackened veins snaking up her arm. They pulsed faintly, as though alive. "I've been down here for days or weeks. Time doesn't make sense anymore," she said. "But the mansion, it's trying to make me part of it." Ethan stared at her arm, a sinking feeling settling in his chest. "Do you know how to stop it?" Liz shook her head. "No, but there's something deeper in this place. A source. If we can find it." Her words were cut off by a sudden, deafening groan. The walls trembled, and the floor beneath them began to crack. Shadows spilled from the fissures, writhing like living creatures. A low, guttural voice echoed through the chamber, "You cannot escape. You belong to me." Ethan and Liz exchanged a terrified glance. "Run!" Ethan shouted, pulling her toward a narrow passageway at the far end of the room. As they fled deeper into the mansion's bowels, Liz began to slow, her breaths ragged. "I can feel it," she gasped. "It's pulling me back." Ethan stopped, gripping her shoulders. "No. You're coming with me. We'll figure this out together." Liz shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "You don't understand. It's not just the mansion. It's her." Before Ethan could respond, a figure emerged from the shadows ahead. It was Lalaurie, her expression calm and calculating. "You think you can defy me?" she asked, her voice soft but laced with menace. "You are already mine." Liz cried out as the blackened veins on her arm spread rapidly, consuming her skin. Ethan tried to pull her away, but she collapsed to the ground, writhing in pain. "Stop this!" Ethan shouted at Lalaurie. "Let her go." Lalaurie tilted her head, a cruel smile playing on her lips. "Why should I? She sought me out, just as you did. She made her choice." As Liz's body convulsed, the shadows around her began to coalesce, forming a dark cocoon. Ethan reached out, but an invisible force threw him backward. "No," he screamed, his voice echoing through the chamber. The cocoon pulsed once, twice, then shattered, revealing Liz no longer human. Her eyes were voids of darkness, her features twisted into something unrecognizable. She turned to Ethan, her voice a hollow echo. "Run," she said. "Before it's too late."